Welcome everybody to the second session on the currency of politics by Stefan Eich. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you who are present with us and those of us who will be watching, hopefully, if technology allows us, who will be watching the recorded version of the webinar. Most probably this will work out, as technology now is relatively easy, so even us can master technology or think that we master technology. Perhaps this is one of the questions that will be coming out, this relation with technology. Now, I will not repeat the presentation of last time, but for the sake of publicity and inflicting upon you the pain of advertising, only insist on the fact that the first issue of the European Law Open is already published. The European Law Open is open access, which, as I was saying, is not without its problems. I think it has clear advantages to the extent that everybody gets to read it. There is no paywall. There is no limitation. You don't have to resort to any kind of pirate site in order to have direct access to the PDFs of the articles. At the same time, it has problems in terms of the economic model, but this is for another day. On the first issue, I will only say the following. We have the standard format that we want to try to make familiar the readers of the journal with, which is basically a first part in which long articles are published, not so long as in American legal journals, in which in some cases they are long books, not even short books, but long books. And sometimes they require several days in order to be read. We are talking about pieces around 20,000 words, which is double the normal European size, in the spirit of allowing the argument to be developed, not in order for people to spend too many words, but avoiding, in a way, the straitjacket of the 8,000 word article. And there are four papers that you will find in the first issue. One by Signe Larsen on European public law after empires, the kind of colonial, post-colonial discourse that we want very much to focus on, the Eurafrique, all these kind of issues. I think they should be higher on the agenda of European legal scholarship. The second exporting piece, the EU Mediators Normative Backpack, Sarah Noven, which deals also with a hidden or a not sufficiently analyzed aspect of European integration. A third kind of methodological piece, a way of critique, what can EU law scholars learn from critical theory, by Päivi Neuvonen, which has been already discussed by several of our colleagues in terms of posing the question of how to do European law. And the fourth, apparently a more standard piece, apparently a black letter piece, which is more than that. When can religious employers discriminate the scope of the religious ethos exemption in EU law, which, far from being a boring question, is a burning question in many countries in Europe, in all countries, one way or the other, but in some it has become inflammable stuff in terms of the very old question of what are the limits that some of the employers have in terms of the religious beliefs of their employees. Is, for example, something that is central in Germany, but I will insist not only. And Martijn van den Brink deals with the issue. Next, there are the second section of the issue that is covering or is made up of two symposia. One is very similar to how the symposia of this book will be looking. That is the second symposia, that is the symposia around Mike Wilkinson, authoritarian Europe. The recent book for Cambridge University Press, and several colleagues discuss the book, and then Mike comes with a rejoinder. And the other is also a symposium that revolves around a new idea or a new topic that we want to explore, that is legal geography and European law, with a leading article by Floris de Vite, and then discussion by other colleagues. And then the bonus track, in a way, is the section that is devoted to books. We will not be running reviews. We are under the belief that nobody reads short reviews, apart from the author of the book, and sometimes not even the author of the book. So what we will be proposing are longer review articles. And the difference that you can already see in the first issue is that one of these reviews is about a book that has been recently published. The other is about a book that was published 30 years ago, under the understanding of why should we be reviewing only recent books, apart from the dynamics of publishing itself, on which the publishing houses are clearly interested in the new stuff being reviewed and not the older stuff. But Carol Harlow in this issue goes back to the book of Francis Snyder on New Directions on European Community Law. And we thought it was a very good time to take a stock on what was still relevant on what Snyder was saying in that book. And Carol Harlow does that by means of contextualizing the book and the style of doing EU law that was coming with it. And finally, Neil Walker deals with a recent book, Legalizing Interlegality, edited by Palombella, and does it also in the spirit of the review article of the book. So much for the publicity and the advertising. I think time is running. So what I will do without any further ado is to give the floor to Stefan, who can come back with topics that he thinks were emerging from the previous discussion, or that he will like to put on the table. So Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Agustin. Thank you so much for all of you for being here. Thank you to Isabel, Costas, Leopold for agreeing to comment. I'm very happy there's a Viennese dimension to this, because actually part of the book was written in Vienna at the IWM when I had a fellowship at a really important point. Now, let me just reiterate my gratitude to European Law Open, first of all, to Agustin, to the fellow organizers for making this all possible, for organizing this webinar, and to thank to the discussants, both from last week and today, for their engagement with the book. It's really an honor to have one's work read by such an illustrious kind of group of scholars. So I've been asked to spend just 10 minutes to set the scene, return to some of the questions that were raised in our first seminar on Thursday. I'm not going to try to answer these here and now. That would do them injustice, and I still need to have something to do for the written version. So I'm just going to briefly restate some of the themes that emerged from me from this. Now, Thursday's wonderfully rich comments took us from late medieval Florentine public credit to the green investment framework of the European Commission, from Aristotle to Habermas. But I thought many of the questions revolved in one way or another around the triangle of time or history, language, and law. And so I'm going to say a word about each of these. Let me begin with time or history. One question that Francesca put on the table, but I think that was in the background of many of the conversations that we had, is what is exactly modern capitalist money? And is its emergence inevitably tied to the late 17th century English imperial state and the financial revolution? If not, how else could we tell the history of money, including this interplay that I'm interested in between political currency and capital? As Francesca asked last week, where exactly do the late medieval northern Italian city-states fit in this story? Right? After all, they had complex systems of banking. They were financing themselves through forms of public credit. In order to begin to answer this, Francesca gave another framework that I think is a good jumping off point. Namely, she referred to a minimalist and a maximalist goal of the book. The minimalist goal, as she put it, is to bring money back into the conversation in the history of political and legal thought, as well as contemporary political theory. The maximalist goal is to make a case for a more democratic monetary system. And I think that that's exactly right. But for me, in some way, what's happening in between is where the real action is, between the minimalist and the maximalist goals. The intermediary goal of this geological stratigraphy that I set out is to liberate us, if you so want, is to liberate us from misleading tropes, misleading perspectives that have obscured or diminished or impoverished a kind of full, expansive view onto the political theory of money. There's a line from Keynes from the 1920s that I keep on returning to in this context, which is, a study of the history of opinion is a necessary preliminary to the emancipation of the mind. And that was an important line for me as I wrote the book. And so the goal is to provincialize these origin stories, to apply historical tools of contextualism in order to reveal the distinct concerns and political theoretical motivations of texts that have become canonical. And in our case, this is my judgment, and I'm happy to open it up for conversation, but I happen to think that we are still held captive by a version of Lockeanism and a version of the sound money doctrine. So recovering the political premises and the political goals of Locke's original analysis, which happened to be situated in the late 17th century, can help us here realize that Locke's own goal of trust, the own goal of stability, actually allows for, and in fact frequently requires, solutions that are radically different from the Lockean sound money doctrine. And actually, I think that is one of Keynes's many great insights. And you have to go back to Locke to actually appreciate this. Now, that approach is nonetheless a fine line to walk. Why? Because the risk here is that an attempt to contextualize and provincialize origin stories can actually look like a reification of these thinkers, these very origin stories, right? Why are we talking about Locke again, instead of, say, Florentine public credit or some of the many unjustly forgotten monetary thinkers? Now that takes me over to language, which both Marco and Fernando raised in their comments, because the question of historicization is connected to Marco's challenge of how we map the story told in the book onto the rise of capital. Right? What is actually left of political currency, of money as a linguistic medium in the age of capital? Again, I'm not going to give my answer here, but I think the underlying challenge involves, how do we avoid origin stories? How do we avoid stadial accounts of money, while nonetheless being able to mark difference, not least the difference that the emergence of capitalism makes? In other words, how do we grapple with the multiple temporalities of money, currency, and capital? This means, on the one hand, avoiding stadial thinking, but it also means acknowledging, and this was, I think, at the heart of one of Marco's questions, that capital does not simply displace political currency. So while political currency preceded capital, it continues to exist alongside it, not as an atavism, but as a constitutive, if repressed, dimension that always keeps open a latent possibility for restructuring a relation between capital and currency. And here, for me, the irony of the 6th chapter on the 1970s comes into full play. Because just as philosophy became linguistified, just as philosophy was undergoing its linguistic turn, just as money itself became for the first time fully fiat money anywhere in the world, based on the power of the word, money was simultaneously eclipsed within political theory. Right? In Habermas's account of communicative action, money was and remains, quote unquote, delinguistified. Now, on one level, which I trace in the book, that's a supreme illustration precisely of the blind spot of the politics of money in both the Lockean liberal tradition and the Marxist left tradition. And actually, I think both of these come together in interesting ways in both Habermas and Walzer. But that takes me over to the cluster of law and constitutional law, the legal role and mandate of central banks that Agnieszka flagged and Marco and Fernando also referred to. Because whereas law is granted by Habermas a constitutive ambivalence between facts and norms, right? That's the space for law that Habermas carves out in the early 1990s, suspended between force and right. Money was, by contrast, economized as part of the system and thereby de-democratized. Precisely not granted this ambivalence that I referred to on Thursday as being suspended between trust and violence. And for me, one question that emerges from this is then simply, what would it look like to bring the same comfortableness with ambiguity, the same comfortableness with hybridity that legal scholars display with regard to the law, and to bring that to bear onto questions of monetary politics and monetary policy? How would we translate principles such as the separation of powers that Fernando referred to, or the idea of the social contract, into the monetary realm? What other conceptual tools can we craft in the process? And I think it's here that the contextualizations of these past moments of crises and these past thinkers can actually help us to mobilize conceptual resources and also encourage us to think afresh for ourselves. But at the same time, I think it's no longer enough to point out that money is a constitutional project. And here there's an interesting and for me, absolutely crucial engagement with Christine Desant's work, which was, as you all know, absolutely formative for me. Because simply to point out that money is a constitutional project actually kind of, begs the question of what kind of constitution are we talking about? What kind of constitution would we like it to be? Because after all, even Hayekians would, I think, concede that money is a constitutional project. Right? So the question here becomes, which constitutional tools, which tools of constitutional analysis allow us to open the door to more democratic conceptions of money, more democratically designed monetary systems? And I guess what I'm haunted by here is the way in which Chris's path-breaking analysis of money as a constitutional project can be, and I think actually has been, taken up by those who are hoping to tame it into a kind of constitutional defense of central bank independence. Okay. There's a conversation with Paul Tucker here in the background, who has done this, I think, in the most eloquent and formidable way. But I think it actually kind of tames the kind of radical quality of Chris's framework. Instead, for me, the central question of the epilogue, and a question that resonated through Thursday's discussion, I'm sure is going to resonate through today's discussion, is instead, is a more democratic money possible? And if so, how? Now, the epilogue gives a cautiously affirmative answer to this question, but it simultaneously grapples with the force of the question itself and acknowledges the challenges involved, not least the challenge that Marco flagged, namely, how can we talk about the communicative potential of democratic money in a world in which speech itself often functions as a form of labor from which surplus value is extracted? But also Agnieszka's observations about the way in which central banks and the states now have a crucial role in the de-risking framework of the European Commission, without this green finance obviously marking any kind of turn towards the democratization of money. Right? And in the context of climate change, one could put the question even more forcefully, is democratic money actually an essential tool for addressing climate change or an obstacle? What is the relationship here? Now, the way I look at these questions in the epilogue is through the lens of the interregnum. And in doing so, I try to counter cynicism and frankly, horror at some of the stuff that's happening out there with curiosity. Because at the very least, the idea of neutral money is dead. I think that's fairly clear now, in particular after the kind of pandemic response. Whatever one might think of the democratic lack of green finance de-risking, whatever one may think of all these alternatives that are being discussed, there's no doubt anymore that the state is an essential element of contemporary finance. Similarly, whatever one may think of the highly dubious claim from my perspective on the part of crypto enthusiasts that Bitcoin heralds some kind of democratization of money, at the very least, we're now talking about money and democracy in the same sentence. Now, none of this means that the conversation ahead will be straightforward or that the necessary political coalitions that have to emerge, will do so by happenstance. But at the very least, we seem to be finally able to escape the idea that money is a neutral tool of price stability alone. A neutral tool about which political theory and constitutional law have preciously little to say. Right? Now that should be the opening of the conversation. So let me end here and just express my excitement again and my gratitude about the questions already posed, and I'm sure the many questions that will be posed today. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to all of you for spending some of your May on Zoom. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot. I think you were putting back some very important issues on the table and adding others, because the whole question of Locke and the role of Locke, not only on money, but the whole ambivalence of Locke in many aspects of what we perceive as ambivalence would in itself. I imagine also the Habermas question is going to pop up today at some point or the other. I am under the impression that, as Wolf and Streck rightly put it on that regard, Habermas is extremely German in many ways, and affected by the German debate, which by the time he was switching in terms of law was on the voice of the German Constitutional Court stating that the independence of central bank was proven to be scientifically proven to be superior to other forms. So I imagine, but this probably will go back. Now, we are also very happy that Professor Baradharan has joined us, so we can follow the original schedule, which is basically, there is no mystery on that. We have chosen alphabetical order depending on the days. So what I will do now, extremely briefly, for the sake of time, is to introduce each of the speakers, and they will put his comments in some 12 minutes, more or less, to Stefan. Mirsha Baradharan is professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. She writes about banking law, financial inclusion, inequality, and the racial wealth gap. And for the purpose of this workshop, I think two of her publications are key, two books, How the Other Half Banks and The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, the last dealing very obviously with historical injustice meeting present suffering, so to say. Very much in a spirit that we would like to impress to the European Law Open. So please, Professor Baradharan, the floor is yours.
First of all, a sincere and just, I'm so sorry that I did not have this on my calendar until I saw Augustine's email reminding me to come, and I have no excuse. I don't know why. I think I see that it's on there, but it's at 11:30. Just I'm sorry. I really am. I'm so glad, though, to have the opportunity, because I read this book and then I read it again, and I have cited it already in a current project that I'm working on. It has been so instructive to me. So I was just looking at the places where I've cited your text already in my draft, and a lot of it has to do with the recontextualization of some of the other kind of conversations that have been happening already in the sort of money and democracy space. And I think what I loved about this book is the sort of nuanced take on some of these differences. I think sometimes you get a very on the one hand is, political money. On the other hand is, Locke versus sort of the gold, Locke's gold versus the other kind of populist monies. And I thought you did such a great job at making the debate more nuanced. I was waiting actually until the end for the crypto discussion, but I had read that other paper and I saw that it was in that paper. I don't think you quite included it here. So I'll say that, it's such a ripe moment in monetary history. And I think it is, if you look past and you look at the historical moments where there were these contests over money and money forms, these were big sort of crossroads in democratic governance. There was some sort of expansion, not just of the monetary standard, but of the people, like sort of the we in the democracy. And especially in American history, looking at the revolutionary period, which you talk less about, but then the Civil War, the post-Bretton Woods moment is post-civil rights era. And right now we're talking about perhaps a contraction of the we, unfortunately. And again, you see the crypto moment. So I think we're at a money moment, a money pivot in our history. And this book is just really well timed. And so I wonder if I could bring in some others. So as I was reading, I was thinking about what I mean, obviously there's this appeal to the scientific sort of natural law, I'll call it standard, the Lockean money principle of it has to be some value. The value is outside of the system. It is fixed. And our job is to sort of look for it and find the meaning of it and then adapt it back in. Versus this flexible system, as you note, of just kind of social, as Christine Desong calls it, blood or water. She does this beautiful analogy at the end of her book that you pick up on, and to say, look, it's flexible and giving. And I guess my first thought reading it was, why? Is that just an original sin question? I mean, is that just Locke took us down the wrong road, or perhaps Aristotle? I mean, I had not seen the Aristotle Locke link yet until I read this. So is it just an original sin? And if it is, why? What? Because I think the Greeks got a lot wrong. And, as a proud, descendant of the Persians, I think that we tell this story quite wrongly, right? And I do think that there was another path, perhaps, of monetary ideology or theory that could have been. I certainly know that once we went down this Locke road, there were several other pivots that we could have used, like the Hayek, versus Keynes. There's the, the Lockean point. There's the, Keynes, I guess, several different times in our history. But so I wonder if even at the base, was there another pivot? So that's the first question. The second, I guess I'll sort of just go through what stood out to me in the book is the sort of the effects of these monetary moments of expansion and to the gold. So, I mean, you don't talk much about, and as you shouldn't, sort of just the effects of coming off of gold in Great Britain. And there's several other books right now that are kind of redoing this moment. I don't know if you've read the Lowenstein Ways and Means book yet, but it seems like part of the post-pivot thing that happens is that there's this revisionist history of the prior monetary moment, right? And I think right now because we're in this pivot, we're looking back at the last, let's say post-Bretton Woods and reviewing what went wrong, what was that thing. And so, a lot of people are going back to the Volcker myth. A lot of people are going back to the sort of causes of inflation. And you see this debate happening right now, where it's the people who were traumatized by, thought Volcker was a hero versus the people who, thought Volcker crushed labor and don't want to go down that road again. And so is that storytelling. And I think Friedman's monetarism was very much a revisionist history of, Keynes, obviously you've pointed that out, but the Great Depression. And there's some part of this historical look. And I see your book as like a really brilliant and imperative contribution to this moment right now to say, hey, look, like Summers is wrong here. Volcker wasn't maybe the hero, or at least maybe you're not saying something so crude, but like I would probably say that. So the second question, I guess, is what is the story then, if we're going to counter this monetarism myth of the 70s post Bretton Woods? And then third, and again, I hate to be to push you beyond where you were comfortable going in the book, or didn't want to go, maybe weren't interested in going, but the sort of dollar empire place that we're at now, where I wonder if it's even possible to imagine our way out of the US dollar standard. And I'm thinking here of several international economists' work, Adam Tooze in particular, the Sanctions, a book that just came out by Nicholas Mulder, and several other kind of focused work on the sort of inflexibility, perhaps. There's just like the entrenchment of the dollar as the world's currency, and where does that fit? Because that seems to me like a vindication of just Keynes and the flexible spending. We're just, if the world's swap line, there is no limit. There's no natural limit, certainly, but there's also this like necessity, it seems, to at least cover what is actually happening with the myth that there is this fixed supply, right, of money, at least on domestic front, right? And it seems the more the dollar becomes the world's sort of like hegemonic currency, the more we're having these austerity debates at home, which seems just like crazy paradoxical, but perhaps a political necessity, because we can't just say like, yes, we're doing this and we can have everything we want at home. And so I wonder what you see as kind of that theoretical sort of like debate looking like. And I won't take more time because I already feel terrible for being late. So thank you. It was so fruitful. I have many, many more things to say. I've cited it a billion times. It was just a fantastic, fantastic book.
Thank you so much, Marissa. I'm so glad you joined us. Don't feel bad. This is so amazing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think implicitly, we push the book beyond chapter 6, which, looking from many perspectives that were brought in, that makes a very good excuse also to push Stefan onto the Eurozone crisis and beyond. The goal, in many ways, was invoke the exorbitant privilege. Richard Triffin could also be somebody to speak about. Let's, however, keep according to the program. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce next Isabel Fechner, who is professor for public law and international economic law. And I am very envious of the international economic law part at the Institute of International Law, European Law, and European Public Law at the Julius Maximilians University of, and I hope to pronounce it correctly, Würzburg. No, I fail all the times. It's a great pleasure for many reasons, some of which only partially because there are also more existential reasons, so to say. But she's the author not only of many extremely important writings, including her book on the law and politics of WTO waivers, but of a text that I think for all of us of the Money Group, which is the background of this webinar in many ways, is a key text. That is Public's Law Rationalization of the Legal Architecture of Money. What might legal analysis of money become? Which, if I'm not wrong, is in the German Law Journal, which is one of the few articles that we would really like to have published before in the European Law Journal, now in the European Law Open. So I think for us it's a fundamental text, and for this reason, among others, it's a great pleasure to have Isabel with us and to give her the floor now.
Isabel, excuse me, but we cannot hear you for some reason.
Should we stop order and then come back to Isabel, I guess?
What she's suggesting is that we continue with some others,
and then we come back to you when she has fixed
yes.
the technical problems.
Yes.
Very good. So I will have to proceed in Monty Python way to say, and now for something totally different. But actually, it's not true. That is something totally different. It's also an enormous pleasure, academic and personal, to introduce Kostas Lapavitsas. Kostas is professor of economics at SOAS, University of London. He is an economist in the full meaning of the term, which, in my understanding, means a socially and politically situated political economist. And among his recent publications, I will recent in the sense of an aging man, I mean, which I am. So I tend to say recent, even if they are not so immediate or this kind of publish or perish way. How Finance Exploits Us All. The collected papers contain in Marxist monetary theory, which I think very probably will be relevant in the discussion now, and most recently, Capitalism in the Ottoman Balkans, Industrialization and Modernity in Macedonia in co-authorship, and several edited and author books on the, let's call it, polycrisis of the European Union, leading to the left case against the European Union, which I assume would be some 100 pages thicker by the time Kostas would write the second edition covering the emergency government of the COVID pandemic and the fallout of the Ukraine war. So please, Kostas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agustin. I hope you can hear me. There are no connection problems. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to join you. I read the book by Stefan. It's an important book. It's erudite, it's balanced, it's measured. He has things to say which will stand the test of time. I had actually used some of the work that Stefan had already done on Aristotle, to which I will come back. And I'd actually used some of it teaching over the summer at the new school where I am at the moment. So it was a happy coincidence when Agustin asked me to speak. Basically, the book, as I understand it, attempts to reestablish, in a sense, the political and logical dimension and legal dimensions of money, legal aspects of money as a social phenomenon. And it's in line of other with other similar non-economic attempts to bring out the anthropological, the historical, the social content of money. And there is no end to what one can say about money once gets into it. More than that, though, the book has got a political aim, and I tend to respect books that do that. It has a political aim, and basically that is to put on the table proposals for a democratic and radical critique of current monetary policy and the institutions that that implement, design and implement such policy, and design and implement the way that modern money works, and particularly central banking, and what this has meant. As I've already mentioned, I particularly appreciated the discussion of Aristotle. As you know, the discussion of the monetary dimensions in the economic thinking of Aristotle goes back a long time, but Stephen finds something interesting and new to say still, which is a measure of how good the book is, where he develops the difference between the money as chrima and money as nomisma. The distinction is drawn very well and in an interesting way, particularly when he gets on to the discussions of reciprocity, where Aristotle gets onto that in the Ethics, and where he tries to establish reciprocity by analogy, which is of course connected to his own, this Aristotle's understanding of justice. What's particularly important here is that Aristotle battles with the precise numerical aspect of this reciprocity. He seeks to establish the proportion that is not accidental, and that has implications for what I'm going to say next. I stress this because that aspect of money and monetary reciprocity has got a precision that often discussing the political, social, and other dimension of money is not appreciated. Aristotle is obsessed with that. Why 5 to 7? Why 2 to 9? What is it that determines that? And what is the meaning of justice in this connection? And of course, one can easily see the import of it. If you go into the market, reciprocity is indeed very precisely established. You know exactly the price you'll pay for one thing against another. If you exchange gifts, there is no numerical reciprocity of the same type. If you exchange things within the family, numerical reciprocity, precise numerical reciprocity, again disappears. The market does it. What is it then that does that? And Aristotle gives battle with this. He fails, and he admits he fails. He says, I can't do it. Stephen then argues that this has to do with the political and conventional dimension of money, but things get rather complex there, and I want to spend some time on it. And I will spend time on it by engaging with the book critically, which is the highest accolade I can give it. Now, part of the umbrella under which the book works is to sideline, I won't say reject, but to sideline origin stories. It's expressly formulated in those terms. Origin stories must be sidelined or, I don't know how to put it, not rejected quite, but sidelined. Now that comes from Descent's book, obviously, where she makes a similar point. I'll have occasion to come back to that in a minute, but let me just say, actually in Stephen's book, that's not quite the case. There is an origin story. Except that the origin is not the economic or market origin. It is the non-market and non-economic origin. So it's not quite fair to say that we will sideline the origin stories. It is to say that the market or the economic origin story is not as strong as the other. And then do other things with it. And Stephen emphasizes here that the origin story that he implicitly and at times explicitly accepts is of a particular type, which basically says that credit underpins all money, that there is a relationship of credit and the relationship of trust, which underpins all forms of money. That was already picked up in the discussion in the first session we had, and an obvious problem was pointed out. Stephen came back to it in introducing today, but I think that the problem persists, and I will say more about it in a minute. In discussing the origin stories, pride of place is given to Locke. I don't think that, I am a bit skeptical about that. I think too much is made of Locke when it comes to money. I think there are others who are more important than Locke in doing what, in supporting that particular dimension of money, the extra political dimension, the naturalization position as Stephen calls it. But perhaps the best way to approach that is by looking at Marx, who is very important in Stephen's book too. Marx appears in this discussion, particularly Marx of the earlier years, the Marx of the Paris manuscripts and other works, the Grundrisse, also Marx of Das Kapital, but not the Marx who writes on money having read Ricardo, not the Marx who writes on money having read Smith. I mean, they've been influenced by Smith and Ricardo, and not the Marx also who has read Hume and Sir James Stewart. So I don't quite understand why Sir James Stewart continues to be ignored in these debates, because to me, he is the most pivotal of those writers. And Marx openly says that, yeah, that he is the person from whom I learned how to understand monetary policy and monetary theory. But that Marx that stays outside or is sidelined in this important book is the Marx who accepts the economic origin story of money. Because Marx made no bones about it. He was one who accepted the origin story. He developed it. He gave it a dialectical Hegelian dimension, an Aristotelian dimension as well. It's Aristotle clearly in Marx's discussion of where money comes from. And that's the Marx who basically says that money has a an economic dimension and an economic origin. It comes out of the market, and that characterizes how money works for Marx. So much so that Schumpeter called him a metalist. I think Schumpeter was wrong, but I can see why he would call him that. The question then that arises here, and I wish Stephen had confronted it directly, is why did Marx do that? Why did he start in a different, broader, philosophical, political, and other tradition? And why did he go towards the economic dimension of money, the economic origin story? And I say this because in the first the session we had last week, Stephen himself said, I was inspired to write the book by following the footnotes in Marx. Well, why then did Marx do that? Why did he go that way once he had read the classical political economists? And I would say that he found something in this, in the approach of the classicals, which the non-economic treatments of money could not provide him with. I would suggest that he found something in it which places the politics of money and the other aspects that are so important in a different context, in a context that matters for policy and for democratizing money, which is Stephen's concern. Why? Now, at the risk of beginning to sound crude and going back to approaches that have long been defunct, one is to say the economic functioning of money sets certain parameters, sets certain constraints for what the politics of money can do. The transformative aspect of money is not in the discretionary power of the monetary authorities. The politics of money, which is very, very important, is qualitatively different to say the politics of tax or the politics of fiscal policy. The room for the state to move and to implement monetary policy is determined in important ways by the autonomous functioning of money, even when that money is not a commodity money, to which I will come back in a minute. There is a monetary structure, there is monetary institutions, there are monetary dimensions which are private, the capital that we're looking at, which impose a certain logic to what money does, which is beyond the state. And if the state intervenes, then it will affect the very accumulation of capital itself. It will go straight to the heart of how the capitalist economy works, which tax cannot do. Tax obviously have impacts on accumulation. Tax obviously impacts on economic life, but not in the same way. It skims value, it affects the utilization of resources and so on, but it doesn't affect the very the mechanics of circulation, of accumulations as well. This is the delights of Can you hear me all right now? So there is I would say there is an internal logic to what money does, which is very, very important to understanding the politics of money. In this connection, then, the form of money and the functioning of money are of paramount importance. And it brings me back to the issue that was raised in the first session on Stephen's book. Stephen thinks that modern money is entirely fiat. He repeated it in the introduction we had today, he gave today, that it is fiat. And it is fiat because the state basically, I'm not entirely certain how he thinks it's fiat, but it's fiat. But it isn't. It is and it isn't. The bulk of modern money is actually credit money produced by private capitalist operators, banks that engage in profit making. Important components of the modern monetary structure are indeed fiat of a kind. Even that money created by the central bank is not directly fiat in the sense in which other forms of money, which Stephen discusses, Fichte's money, for instance, was straight fiat. Modern central banking money is not fiat, and it is not fiat in that narrow sense, because it is created in the banking way. If the central bank wants to create money, he has to buy assets. He has to calculate the impact of the rate of interest. He has to see how the balance sheets of other financial operators will be affected. He has to measure what will happen in the money market. Fichte's fiat money, elementary 18th, 19th century fiat money didn't do that. You established a ministry of finance somewhere or an office of your economics ministry, and you produced bits of paper that you flood the circulation with. That's a very, very different, it operates quite differently to that modern money. And that also holds, of course, for commodity money. Commodity money is not similar to credit money, and it is not similar to fiat money. Commodity money, and that Locke comes in, but more so Adam Smith, and obviously crucially Ricardo, and even Sir James Stewart. Commodity money has its own value. That's what Marx was very impressed with. It has its own value. It comes out of the bowels of the earth through the application of human labor, and that imposes a certain logic to what it can do. And it imposes a certain logic to what it does for prices. It dictates to the extent to which it can steady prices and stabilize them. And that has implications, all these differences in the forms of money have implications for what money does, how it acts as a measure of account, as a measure of value, how it acts as a unit of account. What's the difference between measure and value, or value and unit of account? Jeffrey Ingham, to which Stephen refers repeatedly, doesn't see the difference. A lot of people don't see the difference. And I will mention a couple of things about this difference in a minute. How does it work as a means of payment? How does it work as means of hoarding? These different forms of money work very differently. Now, which brings me to the last chapter, the crucial chapter in a way, for policy. The state intervenes critically in contemporary money. All you need is your bare eyes to see it. Keynes was indeed of crucial importance, and Stephen discusses him very sensitively in understanding the importance of managed money, as he called it, the money of the 20th century capitalism. But that doesn't mean that the state can do what it likes, nor does it mean, and that is where there is more thought in terms of what the form of money looks like, nor does it mean that modern money is depoliticized. De-democratized, I would fully agree with. Depoliticized, not at all. Actually, modern money is the most politicized form of money we know. It is complete politicization. And that is what makes it so peculiar. By this kind of money, I mean central bank money, right? Which is not private bank money. In this connection, what we've got is the opposite of neoliberalism. Hayek knew it. Hayek wrote crucially and powerfully about it. This isn't neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is about competition when it comes to money. And I mean the final means of payment. In the modern system, we have anything but competition. We've got absolute monopoly in what acts as the legal tender, the final means of payment. And that obviously, that monopoly is the ultimate lever of power of the modern state in contemporary capitalism. That's what makes it different to, say, the Chinese state or other states that possess resources directly. But how to approach it, how to understand it, to what extent, how far can we go in democratizing it? Is Proudhon still important in this connection? Is Proudhon still important, still relevant? One more point before I come to that. I know I've nearly taken my time. There is one more dimension here, which again, he was mentioned in discussion, and I would have appreciated more debate, because I'm sure Stephen will do a very interesting discussion of this, which is, of course, the world dimension of money. All this money that we're talking about is domestic money, fundamentally domestic money. But we know that the most important form today is world money. In other words, that very peculiar aspect of money that Marx talks about, that Sir James Stewart talks about, that a lot of the monetarists, the mercantilists that Stephen talks about understood very well, the global aspect of money, which is very different to the domestic aspect. And the global aspect of money is, of course, the dollar today. The dollar, and it is managed in extraordinary ways. The way in which it works as unit of account is managed. The way in which it works as means of payment is managed. The way in which it works as reserve is managed. And of course, the management is strategic. We always knew it when we looked at foreign exchange swaps operated by the Federal Reserve of the United States. But the strategic use has become abundantly obvious in the Ukraine war, where basically even private property of others, never mind state property, has been appropriated by the imperial power, the dominant imperial power, because it's in dollars, fundamentally. It's in dollars. So then, I haven't got time. I'll just leave you with some personal reminiscences of this. How to intervene. Here, I go back to Marx, and I will share, but defend, Stephen's points about Marx being highly skeptical about how far can you influence capitalism and change capitalism and democratize money, and by democratizing money, change the system itself. Marx was scathing about this, as you know, and you mentioned it in your book very clearly. Is this still the case? Not quite in the same way as I would argue as in Marx's day, but I'll give you some personal dimension here. The most important experiment in introducing new forms of money and democratizing money in the last few years was actually in Greece. People don't talk about it, but the issue of getting out of the euro and introducing a national currency was a very, very important question in which I was personally involved, and I saw it at firsthand, how it works and whether you can actually democratize society through money and what you can do to it. I can tell you then quickly that the question was technical, and that is because of how money is integrated into accumulation. In other words, what you could do was limited by the technical dimension. You couldn't do what you liked. You could certainly introduce a new form of money, but you had to follow certain technical constraints. And these technical constraints had to do with key questions. Would you introduce parallel currencies? Would you change the currency immediately? How would you make sure that the clearing mechanism of the banks worked? Because if you couldn't sort out the clearing mechanism, nothing would work. The market would seize up. So there had to be a clearing mechanism that would work. Then what rate would you introduce the new currency at? Now, the rate brings out an important issue, which I'm afraid a lot of people still don't get. We could set the unit of account, for sure. It was up to the state to choose the unit of account. A lot of people get very confused about this. My own view was set it at 1-to-1. It was the simplest way of setting the new unit of account. 1 euro, 1 new drachma. Could we set the measure of value? Far from it. We had no power on the measure of value. The people don't understand. The measure of value would be set by the markets. In other words, once you'd set the unit of account, then it would be entirely up to the market system to work out the measure of value. And that is how Marx understood the measure of value. Of course, it's not in the gift of the state. Society as a whole works out the measure of value. Did it mean that the unit of account was irrelevant? Not at all. The unit of account was also a social question. Why? Because you could bring redistributive policies through that. Change it as one-to-one. Well, change some deposits as one-to-one, change others as 1.3 to 1, change still others as 0.8 to 1, depending on wealth. And then you have immediately income redistribution. These were real political questions, and that's what we could do, but not the measure of value. The measure of value was completely beyond us, and it was actually in the gift of the international markets. You introduce the new drachma, you change it one-to-one with the euro, the markets will tell you, actually, my friend, the value is 0.2 to the euro or 0.3 to the euro. And that's the unit, that's the measure of value. That's beyond this. So these were the technical questions. There were also the political questions. Once you went beyond the technical questions. What were the political questions? Well, how radical will you be? What would it mean? Because obviously to do that, you'd have to reinvent the central bank. And if you reinvented the central bank, you'd have to nationalize the private banks. And we'd have to do all kinds of other things to make sure that, that the commodities markets were well supplied. These are political issues. And at a further remove, everything was social and a class issue in the end. Whether you could do all that and at what rate you could do it depended on the class composition and the balance of class forces. And in this context, the Greek establishment was the main factor in stopping the country from moving out of the euro. It wasn't the lender. The lender, in other words, Germany, the lender was perfectly prepared to contemplate Greece getting out of the euro. It was actually the domestic constellation of social power that stopped the country from doing it. It was adamant about it. It was a social and a class question. Why? Because changing the monetary unit would have dealt an enormous blow to the existing structures of power in Greece, and they were not prepared to contemplate that. So it failed. Why? Why were the subaltern classes, to use Gramsci's term, not capable of taking it on, other than the fact that organizationally they were weaker? Why? Two reasons are of paramount importance from my experience. The first is very simply identity. Money is also identity. And that has to be seen very, very clearly here. Any move out of the euro back into the drachma would have been understood by huge numbers of Greeks, in this case, as a step back, as adopting an identity which would have been far more problematic than being European, whatever that meant. Second, and clear for politics, fear. The politics of fear is the most prevalent dimension of politics that I know of today. Fear manipulated from the top, fear that pivoted on what would happen if we change the unit of account. Because you see, money is something with which all of us are familiar at all times. We carry it in our pockets. It's the thing that teaches us to count. It is a change that is of the most dramatic significance to change the currency. Much more important than any other change. Everybody understands it. If you tell them you'll walk out of your house and you'll carry a different type of money in your pocket, everybody understands it. There is no confusion about it. Social revolutions are not like that very often, right? They're done by small minorities and the others follow. Not when it comes to money. And fear prevailed, manipulated from the top. We couldn't do it. It confirmed the concerns of Marx and Engels that you've already mentioned in your book and in discussion. Money is a very difficult issue on which to base radical, liberating, and revolutionary politics. It is very difficult to do it. Fear and identity block it and make it extremely difficult. Does it mean we can do nothing when it comes to central banks? No, we can do things, but we've got to know the limits within which we operate. I'm sorry, I've taken too long. I hope I've given some things of interest. I engage with your book critically because I think it's an important book. I hope you do appreciate that. And good luck to it, and the best of us to follow.
Thank you so much, Kostas. It's hugely appreciated. We'll continue talking, I'm sure, for many more times.
Thanks, Kostas. I think you combine very clearly a critical approach coming from solid background here with pushing the issue also to the, as you were pointing to the critical chapter on what to do, if not Lenin, what to do Proudhon, what to do whoever, and there are many questions that are involved into there. I'm sure that either in the discussion or later on we will come. The issue was Greece was central on the process, but the same element of identity and fear can be detected in other Eurozone states, even critically in countries which have a much, how to put it, even traditionally, even imperialistic identity, such as France, for example. Where perhaps there is an element that I will add to what you were saying, that is the extent to which the euro became even a sort of secular religion, even. So the element of identity, whatever is the national identity, there was an element of religiosity that keeps to this day, to the extent that is something that cannot be touched. And I think, unfortunately, this is also contaminating other elements of public discussion in which we are increasingly going back to faith. You know, on this, I think Kant and religion within the limits of reason is something that we should perhaps go back to. This is only half a joke. But now, hopefully, the sound problems are fixed, and Isabel can contribute to the discussion. Hopefully it works. Let's see.
Yeah, I'll try. Can you hear me? Oh, perfect. Good. So yeah, first of all, I very much enjoyed reading the book. I very much appreciate its clarity and also the methodological introduction, and the treatments of the different political thinkers are very inspiring to me. I think personally, I liked most the chapter on Marx, because I think it will be very helpful from now on to me, to dispel readings of Marx which read him as a commodity money theorist. I tried to do that in the past, never really successfully, but now this will be extremely helpful. Because I do agree, it's not a commodity theory of money exposed in Marx, just as he doesn't expose an objective theory of value. I'm not sure I share the conclusions you draw from your treatment of Marx. I'll get back to that later, but Kostas, I think, so much better now voiced that concerns that I would be able to do that. So my first point concerns the politics of depoliticization, or rather de-democratization, and I'd like to relate what you say on the politics of depoliticization to the German Constitutional Court's approach to money, and its own, if you want, politics of depoliticization. So therefore, I'd like to draw your attention once more to the Maastricht judgment, the first judgment on European integration, in which the court raised the question whether the independence of monetary policy could be reconciled with the German constitution, and in particular, the principle of democracy. So let's look at the argumentation of the court. The starting point was monetary policy is an exercise of public authority. So money is political, we could say, the court recognized. As a consequence, principally, it must be subject to democratic control, thus the court, which means, according to the court, controlled by democratically elected representatives of the people. That's the very reductionist understanding of democracy, I would say, of the German Constitutional Court. Yet then monetary policy by an independent central bank is not subject to such democratic control. So the Federal Constitutional Court states that this must be understood as a modification of the principle of democracy that in turn requires a justification. So what is the court's justification? The justification holds that independent experts are better at safeguarding the stability of money. The main reference, of course, becomes inflation and the Bundesbank's past success in reining in inflation, and that's where they then get from the scientifically proven what Agustin had referred to at the outset. So why is the stability of money so important that it justifies a departure from the principle of democracy and uncontrolled expert rule? because, so the court, it's essential for individual freedom and for the finances of a democratic state. We could thus conclude from this that the Federal Constitutional Court agrees that money is the, as you stated in your book, the foundational institution of democratic self-rule. And it also mentions in one sentence, democracy and money. So I would argue that's not really so special. But of course, the question becomes, how to save this democratic foundation that money is also according to the court. And so because it's so foundational, the court says it should not be governed democratically. So the Federal Constitutional Court appears to be more Lockean rather than ignorant of or attempting to conceal the political nature of money. My question from this observation is then the following. Maybe it's not so much the presentation of money as apolitical that stands in the way of rediscovering monetary management, design, or experimentation as a crucial element of emancipatory politics, but the insufficient account of the distributive effects of different monetary designs and policies. So the question to the political theorist becomes, to what extent does political theory help us better understand the distributive consequences of money and different monetary designs? And those distributive effects were, of course, one reason why the Federal Constitutional Court then in the recent PSPP case, once again, was asked to pronounce on monetary policy. In PSPP, the court continues to adhere to the justification of an undemocratic monetary politics. What becomes clear in this case is that for the court, the justification is not only based on the assumption that only a body independent of democratic politics can get monetary policy right and secure the stability of money, but that this justification also depends on the assumption that monetary politics has no, or at least very limited, distributive effects. The more apparent the distributive effects then become, and they have become very apparent, the more difficult becomes the justification of central bank independence as an exception from democracy, especially if in addition it is recognized, as the central bank itself recognizes, that monetary policy is a matter of judgment and discretion and not the strict application of rules. The court seeks to address the problem that thus arises for democracy by limiting the scope of monetary policy. It does not envisage that the central bank itself might be democratized. And here I want to come back to your book. I agree with Stefan that it would be a very important task for political theory to think seriously about what democratizing monetary policy could look like. I agree that it would be reductionist to see only a choice between expert rule on the one hand and representational democratic politics on the other, as the Federal Constitutional Court seems to do, and that it would be very worthwhile to think about an internal democratization of the ECB, which you mentioned in the last chapter. But so again, I would want to know what political theory, past and present, has to offer as concerns the democratization of specifically economic institutions, if one wants to regard money as an economic institution, which works according to different logics than in other spheres of politics. Now, my second remark concerns the political possibilities of monetary politics. The book offers an explanation why contemporary political thinkers such as Habermas no longer paid attention to money as a site for democratic politics. You offer two explanations, I understand, why this is the case. First, the unsurmountable legitimacy challenges posed by democratization of the economy. And second, the acceptance of Marx's observations on, and I quote you, the limits of imposing justice on capitalist economic relations. And that's what Kostas talked about right now. So I'd like to take issue with this second explanation. I would argue with Marxian Wertkritik as formulated by Robert Kurz, that volume 1 of Capital sets out how surplus value becomes the automatic subject of society, as also Marx calls it, As such, value has totalizing effects and structures society in its entirety, not just the economy. Capitalist value production determines and explains the totality of society, not just the structure of the economy. According to Wertkritik, this operation of value is then also responsible for the three major and interlocking crises of environmental destruction, imperial and potentially nuclear wars, as well as global economic inequality. So I don't think that Habermas would agree in that sense with Marx, or this reading by Wertkritik of Marx, because this view of capitalist value production is irreconcilable with democratic liberal constitutionalism. Thus, I rather think that what led Habermas to abandon the project of economic democracy is a concession to insights of systems theory and the limits of democratic politics to steer and impact the economy that operates according to a different logic or different language and employs a different medium of communication. Accepting that there is such a separate sphere of the economy operating according to its own logic or language, and with a drive towards surplus value production, does not mean subscribing to a view that this sphere subordinates and colonizes all other societal spheres, as expanded by Wertkritik. Such an approach then also opens up a reform perspective that seeks to limit the realm of economics or the market, and that seems to be the Walzer approach described in your book, or to rein in excesses of surplus value production by placing limitations on money as the medium of the economic system. The latter is proposed, for example, by Gunther Teubner, who in this respect builds on sovereign money proposals by Joseph Huber. He thus does not want to redesign money for more emancipatory politics, but just to limit money in order to contain the destructive excesses of economic surplus value production. So my last remark, what if we were to take Marx seriously, or at least were to revive the project of economic democracy? It seems to me that the book that you see the reconciliation of democracy and capitalism as one aim of recovering the political malleability of money or of democratic money. And that might then also explain the choice of political theorists and ideas that the book deals with, which was touched on during the last webinar. On the other hand, economic democracy figures prominently in the book, yet economic democracy, in my view, is difficult to envisage as reconcilable with capitalism. But again, I would like to pose this as a question: is democratic capitalism the objective that motivates the book? And if this is the case, why did you not aim at a more radical transformation of political economy? The other question connected to the project of economic democracy concerns the suggestion, or your suggestion, that it might be more promising to focus on money than on the mode of production, and in particular labor. So I quote here from your book, you say, "We have long been familiar with calls to treat sites of production as fundamentally political and to democratize the relations of power that structure them. Not only should the same political logic apply to the production of credit as well, but the democratization of credit holds arguably even greater promise than those workplace strategies. Since today, the balance of power between capital and labor has decisively tilted toward the former. Central banks and financial regulators emerge in this picture as essential sites of political contestation in contemporary capitalism." Quote end. So first of all, I would want to say that when I began to start doing research on money, I had the same intuition that it might be promising to focus on money, possibly more promising to focus on money than on labor to achieve transformation. Yet I think I thought so for different reasons. My reasoning was that due to the technocratic appearance of money, coupled with the recognition that money and monetary policy needed to be reformed in the wake of the great financial crisis, there might be scope for institutional redesigns that might seem technocratic and still have far-reaching transformative effects. Today, I think that was rather naive. However, I'm not so convinced that while the balance of power between capital and labor has decisively tilted towards the former, the same is not also true for the balance of power between capital and central banks. Think of Daniela Gabo's work, for example, on how central banks have become the central banks of shadow banking, securing the safe assets needed for the latter's transactions. Moreover, I do not see reason to think that because capitalism needs the state, and that's, I think, one argument in your book, and the state's guaranteeing of the infrastructure of money, there is a greater chance of overcoming capitalism through the reform of money than through changing the modes of production. After all, we could also argue that capital needs us, human beings, and that capital exploitation would not exist with our willing cooperation. And that brings me to the final point. If there is no hope in organized labor, and if we can also not trust in the state, why not envisage something like commons public partnerships, also in the realm of money, as instruments to transform political economies? I'm not thinking about a privatization of money, but of the conceptualization of, for example, complementary currencies as monetary alternatives located between state money and private money. I was wondering why they made no appearance in the book, which in the epilogue seems to merely envisage money as either state money or private money or the outcome of a public-private partnership. Thank you. That was my comment.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, there was so much in there. Thank you.
Last, but definitely not least, is Leo Specht. I think I'm right in saying that Leo's day job is as barrister, but in what I would regard as a very continental tradition, which is getting lost, unfortunately, he manages to have an evening and a night job as a scholar, with a number of publications on his account, gravitating not only around EU law, but more deeply about legal theory. And what we are discovering every day now was a pivotal process in the recent history of Europe, the transformation of the former Soviet Union and of Eastern European countries after 1989. But he is also, of course, a member of the Money Reading Group, which is at the origin of this workshop. So please, Leo, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I also want to say that I learned a lot when reading your book. And as a kind of ironic footnote to this statement, if I would have read your book some 35 or 40 years ago, I would not have allowed mainstream economists at the University of Vienna to torture me with the so-called transformation problem when I still believed in the value theory in economics. Because I learned from your book to argue that money is a result of covenants and convention, something which I assumed and knew before, but seeing the argument develop through a reading of political theorists and an interpretation of political theorists did help foster this knowledge and belief, which I will now also use in making 2 or perhaps 3 points. The first is associated with the question, what kind of democracy? And when I am putting forward the question, what kind of democracy, then I'm allowing myself a schematic distinction between the micro and the macro. Or, as I have also taken it from your book, between the domestic and the global, and within the domestic, not only the sphere of the state, as Costas has referred to, but more experimentalist the level of the enterprise, the municipality, the community, etc. And when I'm posing this question of what kind of democracy, then I would first argue that there needs to be, I would argue for the need there to be a multitude of areas of experiments also based upon varying understandings of money, always backed and supported, of course, by the final guarantee of the state, but still allowing for different forms of money to emerge in order to support varying ambitions to be realized in these experiments. And this brings me to my second point, which it would be a dogmatic legal foundation of this argument or aspiration. And I would start by the relationship between money and property, and would deconstruct property as a bundle of rights. If this is so, then money should have or should allow for a corresponding vision of money as a bundle of different aspirations. So if property underlies money and contractual relationships are the basis for the creation and issuance of money, we all know that credit relations are the source of money, then there should be also space for different forms of money and different input in the creation of money. And again, this can only happen if guaranteed by the state, which brings me to the next point. What is the democratic process of decision-making and deciding which kind of prerogatives, which kind of programmatic ambitions to be realized on which level of social organization or state institution? And I think it is very important to have the courage also to err on the side of one or the other, in parentheses, theoretical experiment, when trying to think through what could be the foundational basis of democratic experimentalism in the connection of creating or in relation to creating and framing money. Now, this discourse is, as we all know, vastly debased, not accepted in the mainstream, for reasons which are also very well explained in this book. But, and now I'm taking up something which has been said by way of introduction, I think that the political experiment of the Soviet Union and the implosion or destruction of this experiment has vastly contributed to delegitimize attempts to conceive of alternative experiments to what we know as monetary capitalism. And to make this point clear, I would like to point to the following. the post-Soviet systems in terms of their monetary policy. So now post-Soviet systems, I mean countries like Russia, like the Ukraine, like White Russia, like Kazakhstan, in terms of their monetary constitution, are the paradise of the economic orthodoxy. Banks function there very often as described in textbooks, but most importantly, central banks, while of course politically dependent or dependent from political decision making, but they act as apolitical or non-political institutions within a political system. I don't know whether you have taken this up, but the chairperson, the president of the Russian Central Bank, has been the central bank of the year 2 years ago. In terms of what we have read about the description of the Russian economic and political system, this is either ironic or very descriptive. So the replacement of a political experiment with a system, and quote, monetary system, and I would discuss and debate and reject the idea of the Soviet system being based on money as we have analyzed it in our traditions. But the transformation of this system led to a kind of monetarism, which I believe characterizes very well the mainstream, which is not a caricature, but it is the full expression of its political impressions. And I would be very interested to prolong a discussion like the one which we have had in this book on to this transformation of the Soviet and post-Soviet context and its implications for our own discussions, and most importantly, for the political transformations which started in the 70s, but then took place in the 80s and 90s, which I would describe as a destruction of welfare.
Thank you so much for this. A lot to be talked about.
Very good. I think it is now time for, it is only fair that Stefan will get the chance to reply to the comments that have been made. So Stefan, please.
I'm going to keep this very short because I really want to hear from others in the room. But just to tie a few loose ends together, I think that there's a part of the conversation that pushed me on Locke, be it in the form of Mercer's question about is there a story about an original sin, about alternative possibilities, to Costas's challenge whether really Locke is really where it's all about. For me, actually, the conversation before I had a chance to formulate my own question took us precisely where I would wanted to go, namely that for me, the reason Locke continues to, or Lockeanism rather, continues to hover over us is because Locke is a stand-in for the fear that came up in several of the comments. Like the idea that there is a hesitation, various diverse reasons behind it, but there's a hesitation to actually engage in the kind of political experimentation when it comes to money for, reasons that I think are best described as fear. And Locke is, I think, the original source in instilling a fear about political fragility in us. And Isabel's comment about the German Constitutional Court, I think, is really on point here. That's, I think, the fear that, not just the Constitutional Court, but also the Bundesbank have been actively creating since the 1970s. In fact, if you look at the kind of annual reports that the Bundesbank puts out in the 70s, it's all about constructing a narrative of fear that is tied to the experience of hyperinflation in the 1920s, and that justifies essentially a de-democratization of money. So if I have one target that holds all this together is to displace this fear, to make us a little bit less afraid of thinking about money and democracy in one sentence. Okay? And that's the role of Locke, really. Not because of Locke's theoretical insights, not because of a claim about the influence that specific measures have, but Locke is the stand-in for the fear that continues to hover over us. And I think it's actually, as strong today as it was beforehand. Now, that doesn't mean that once you open the door towards a conversation about democracy and money, everything will right itself, right? This is, I think, where I differ from the kind of more MMT style discussion, where it's just a call for getting your act together and imposing a certain, notion of rule, order, structure, justice onto money. Instead, Marx comes into the conversation for me as someone who precisely cautions against the malleability of money as a tool of political rule. But, and this takes us back to where Agustin started us off last week, Proudhon, instead of being forced to choose between Proudhon, slightly naive, Republican credit reform, or Marx, a kind of disenchanted rejection of monetary. I want to have Proudhon and Marx. I want to have Daniela Gabor and normative political theory at the same time. And that means developing an account of modern money precisely as a hybrid, not just simply pure fiat and the state can do what, not Fichte and fiat, but instead always this hybrid, the state with some room for maneuver, heavily constrained by forces of capital, private markets, but with some discretion, exactly not over value, but over unit of account, over questions that genuinely matter, distributionally, democratically, ideationally, and that nonetheless will always be constrained and will be insufficient to overcome capitalism, right? So Proudhon and Marx together as a way to think through, and this is why I like where experimentation came up, as a way to think about the way in which we might have a little bit more discretion than we give ourselves credit for once we shake off fear, but we have to embrace this discretion experimentally without a naive idea of just a full malleability. That's going to end, not just is going to be frustrated, but I think it's actually a dangerous path of democratic disenchantment. If we actually are finally able to do the things we were hoping to do, and then it turns out they don't work, that might be worse than not trying. So instead, we need to have a democratic politics of money that is, constrained and experimental, that tries to move into the spaces that open up without giving into excessive voluntarism. But that means, and that's where Marissa's question about the history and the stories come back in, it means becoming aware of the contingency in previous moments that still hang over us. The quote that I think I have in the Keynes chapter that is so resonant for me is Sidney Webb in the outgoing Labour government after Britain goes off gold, who says, witnessing the Conservatives going off gold, no one told us we could do this. And I think that's the kind of collective response we should have with regard to the fear, that actually we can do more than we often think. But that action has to be experimental. It has to kind of look for openings. It has to be strategic. And it won't ever live up to a full overcoming of capitalism. Now, let me say one more word on world money versus domestic money. I don't say, maybe I should have said more about this in the epilogue. But again, this is where I think the conversation has to go. And that's where the MMT perspectives, I think, from my perspective, too narrow in simply bringing us into domestic conversations, where you have monetary sovereignty and a kind of attempt to resuscitate monetary sovereignty. Instead, our kind of democratic politics will play out in a multi-layered dollar imperial system. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have that conversation. It doesn't mean that there's no scope whatsoever for critical normative thinking, for attempts to democratize relations that are clearly anti-democratic right now. But they will be heavily constrained. So that means, on the one hand, accepting, like Adam Tooze's position that we shouldn't give in to the illusion that there will be a Bretton Woods 2 anytime soon, because that just would be entirely misreading the global power constellation that produced the first Bretton Woods. But saying that doesn't mean that there isn't scope for pushing for a more democratic monetary system, that there's no scope for making central banks themselves more democratic internally. So it's that kind of more modest goal that is, I think, the immediate object of the epilogue. And then, as Isabel highlighted, I think there's a larger question to be had about what possibilities of transformation are simply impossible within that framework of capitalism or dollar hegemony. And again, I think there the right political response would be to precisely point towards the limits in order to show that if you want to go further, then more far-reaching societal changes will be required. You won't be able to reach full economic democracy within a dollar imperial capitalist system. But that doesn't mean that you can't push that system towards small points of democratization. So that's the kind of uncomfortable position that I find myself in many ways agreeing with much of what has been said by the commentators, maybe more than the commentators might realize, but hoping to bring these different divergent perspectives together. Maybe not coincidentally, the project I'm off to after this is to think more about Keynes's politics and Keynes's attitudes towards experimentalism, and whether we can construct a notion of democratic experimentation out of Keynes's political thought. But let me end here in the hope that we have a little bit of time for questions.
Let me ask, Stefan, can I, on the fear, can we finally grain the fear? Is it fear of what? Fear of asset depreciation, fear of, the loss of legitimacy, and are those fears valid? I mean, I know that there are fears right now that seem exactly embedded in the theories of that are wrong, that you want to overcome. And so what is the position of tackling those fears? And I hear you on, it is better to try to not be spooked, but I think this is a problem that only the like reformers have, right? Because there are plenty of mistakes that happen. And so I'm curious about what you see as that fear that is right and what is kind of wrongly.
One of the great ironies is that you often notice the fear coming out most strongly in moments that look like initially moments of emancipation. It's almost a fear of one's own agency, rather than fear of just like something external, something other. And then that often gets wrapped up subsequently into something, okay, there is something else. But if you look more closely, it's actually more often than not fear of your own agency. And maybe tied up with that fear of maybe things don't working out in the way in which you hope they do. Now, I think for me, this actually brings us back to Agnieszka's comments last week, who linked the conversation to climate change. Because in some way, the costs of experimentation are getting lower and lower because not experimenting is not working out very well. So if the alternative of not experimenting is something like climate catastrophe, I mean, what possibly could be the costs of experimentation? It's not that things are going quite well right now, on the contrary. And I think that's, again, a point that Keynes would have appreciated. But yeah, I have to think more about the fear part. It's something just clicked together in the conversation.
Because something is hard. So one thing that keeps popping up historically in those moments is just fear of redistribution, like fear of the exact thing that you're trying to achieve, fear of a loss of status. And that's kind of part of the like populist right-wing move right now. And I would say monetarism derived from that fear, same with some of the other gold sort of standard reifications post-Civil War, is this fear that other people will have relatively higher status, and that's exactly what you're trying to do from this side. So I wonder if that's just like a paradoxical, like, don't worry about that fear. You know,
I mean, in some way, if I could add on, if that's where all we have to worry about, I would actually be feeling pretty good, because just numerically, you know, that's going to work out in our favor. For me, the much more haunting thing is the general election that happens in England after Britain goes off gold, right? So in the fall of 31, there's a general election fought, and Labour runs on a campaign of, you know, essentially not going back to gold and keeping this experimentation open. And the conservatives run on a platform of fear, of actually bringing back gold, you know, preventing the kind of, and what happens is that those who have, you know, to benefit, those who stand to benefit from the kind of specter of redistribution end up voting conservative. Right, so Labour loses almost all their seats, and the Conservatives win that election on the basis of going back to gold. That seems to be much more, much more disturbing and much more real, like living in the US. And
can
much
I
more,
make
much
a
more
sorry? Can I add? I'm sorry to take, and I'll stop after this, but. I mean, I wonder if Michael O'Malley's point of face value strikes you as at all relevant here, because it is the same thing. It is the race issue, right? And if you expand the pie beyond empire or beyond whiteness, right, then you have this backlash, and that the gold standard is, I mean, he makes a very strong claim about it being about like the inherent value that ties into race. But I wonder if race kind of fuses that, is that these people voted not against their own interests, very much for their own interests, but taking the wages of whiteness rather than wages, right?
Yep. And I think that lines up nicely with Kostas's point about identity in the case of the euro, right? There's not just a kind of simple question of economic redistribution at stake, but larger questions of who am I and how does this monetary unit kind of reflect my identity. Absolutely. So I wasn't suggesting people kind of do something irrational, but like the puzzle is deeper. It's not just about redistribution, but it's about identity as well.
But if I may, you were in your rejoinder, you were in a way suggesting a kind of combination of elements from Proudhon and Marx. That raises at least immediately two questions. One is which Proudhon, or whose Proudhon, in many ways, because he was, for many reasons, not a systematic thinker in many ways. There are many contradictions into his work, many changes of shade along the way, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, so, but if we take not the caricature of Proudhon, but we take somebody that at the same time that is trying to explore, as you were suggesting, the possibilities that we have within the limits and constraints of the system as it exists and this kind of stuff, but that is looking at rupture at one point or the other. So it's not a reformist Fabian thinker. There is an element of rupture. Then there is this element that the two must be together in one way or the other. There is exploring what can we do within the certain framework, but what we do within this framework is in view of a different blueprint of how we think about societal relationships and this kind of stuff. And I think that is relevant because very obviously, in terms of constraints, in terms of the fear or the liberalism of fear, we are back into a kind of Cold War mentality in many ways. So we are going to be seeing again the same reflexes that were going in liberal thinking in the Cold War period and this kind of stuff. This is very obvious. But the kind of question in this kind of context where we are facing, looking at things from Europe, Kostas was referring before to Greece and to the possibilities of rupture in Greece. There is on the one side the dollar. The euro was introduced among other promises with a promise that it will allow to emancipate non-Germans from the Bundesbank, and it will allow to emancipate the whole of Europe from the shadow of the dollar. These two promises clearly did not work. This was not Jean Monnet working the external constraint, geopolitical external constraint, and then getting economic autonomy, as Perry Anderson has, or Millward have argued. This did not work that way. It worked in the sense that there is a double bind now. There is the double bind of the dollar and the dollarization of the euro, the Fed being the lender of last resort in many ways, also for European banks. That's very clear. And the straitjacket of the euro, that, as I was saying, is not diminishing in many ways. We changed the conversation. We start talking about the Hamiltonian moment. This is very nice and very, very, we cheer up with that. But then when you start seeing what's going on in terms of policy, is basically that countries are being asked to reduce public expenditure. And this is what actually is happening. It's being covered by the fact that you have now inflation, and then public expenditure is growing less than inflation, and in such a way you are doing it in a quotational marks painless way. But if that is so, then the question is that the constraint seems considerable. So what you can do within the constraint is limited. What is the relationship with rupture? Which brings us to the question of, in the 90s, the idea of revolution was over. That's the ultimate reason, for example, that Rawls' political liberalism was a success, because it was coming right at the time at which it was fitting into into a certain, with all the respect and praise that we can have for Rawls and this kind of stuff. But he was lucky with the theory of justice. He was lucky with political liberalism in terms of timing. This was happening at this time. But now we are in a different point of time in which this kind of assumptions cannot be taken. The idea that reformism is a strategy without shortcomings is completely exhausted. At the same time, the appetite for rupture, for the reasons that, among others, that Kostas was pointing, seems to be limited. But can there not be an element of a horizon of rupture involved into it? Can we simply do it on assuming that democracy and capitalism can easily be reconciled, when it seems a hopeless premise, so to say? Sorry for being so confused.
No, I'm not gonna attempt to put a smiley face onto that analysis, but maybe one way to think about it is to say that, part of my reason for flagging monetary systems aside for political contestation in those closing pages in the epilogue, like Isabel highlighted them, is to point out that precisely this global dollar empire is a shambles. It's a non-system. It's not at all clear to me that this can last for much longer. The only reason, a very strong and important reason, but the only reason it still exists is because there's no alternative. But it has no coherent logic to it. It's a non-system, as Jacques de la Rosière put it. It's a system that is stretched both in terms of economic, financial, technical problems. Think of the kind of complexity of the liquidity systems that have to be devised with every crisis, the kind of plumbing that has to happen, more and more frequently. And even more importantly, it's a non-system when it comes to the political and democratic legitimacy, right? The Federal Reserve is de facto, as everyone who watches it knows, a de facto central bank to the world. There is no scope for the Fed being a central bank to the world in the American Constitution. This is a car crash waiting to happen. We've based our entire global monetary system, not just simply on world money, but on one country's domestic money, a country's, domestic political system itself functioning as a destabilizing constraint that is at best invisible, but always, prone to a crisis itself, holding this all up. In that context, I'm not suggesting that we can democratize that system. That would be silly. But instead, we need to do the groundwork, conceptual and political groundwork, to actually have alternatives ready. Like, we need to do the kind of work that Keynes did with regard to Bancor, to sketch what would it mean.
Alberto, come on, man.
What would it mean to have, a
Alberto,
system
stop looking
of
at me like
global
that.
currency? Sorry, a system of global currency that
Alberto,
is
you're an
different.
asshole.
Fernando, can you kick off?
Yes, I will expel this.
Because
So we need to do the groundwork, the conceptual groundwork, to have alternative plans at least ready, to be able to critique, existing developments, to be able to have a better system against which that non-system can be compared and found wanting. And finally, we need to start building the political coalitions that put pressure on central banks, that actually put forward coalitions, not just domestically, but globally, along the lines of stuff that happened in the 1970s, of what it would mean to actually have an international conversation. Not under the naive belief that this is somehow, gonna come together in some UN General Assembly meeting that produces a Bretton Woods II, but simply to put pressure on those few people that actually have discretion in the system. So that's how I would put, I'm not sure whether it's a positive spin, but there's at least some room for us to do things, philosophical work, conceptual work, and political work, rather than just leap back into a kind of cynicism and despair. So no, I did end with the word cynicism and despair, despite meaning to do the opposite.
Kostas, do you want to intervene?
There are about 1,000 things I want to say, but I know it's late, so I won't. I'll just say a couple of things on the international dimension, which Stefan is right. He needs to write on that. And I look forward to his take on it. Although how he will do it without talking about Ricardo, I don't know, but he will have to do it. The point I want to make is this. On the system, the system of world money, which used to be the gold standard, which actually developed gradually in the 19th century, didn't hold early 19th century. The gold standard becomes a reality only in the late 19th century. The English operated that. It's a mistake to think that it happened spontaneously or whatever. There was a spontaneous dimension, but England worked it, and it was actually an element of imperialism. If you wanted access to gold, you had to go through sterling. And that meant credit, the provision of credit. Now, the dollar replaced that in the 20th century, and American empire was established on a different form of world money, and we're living through it now. Stefan is right. Transforming that is incredibly difficult. I want to start with it. 2 points I will mention here. The first is this. American imperial power pivoting on the dollar, which is undoubted. The Americans have just shown that to us the last couple of months, means subordinate integration for others. It isn't simply a range of choices. Some nations choose to have a lot of sovereignty, and others, for reasons best known to themselves, choose to have less sovereignty. And mostly the ones that choose to have a lot of sovereignty tend to be in the developed West. And the ones that choose to have less sovereignty tend to be in Africa, or tend to be in Latin America, or tend to be elsewhere because they haven't read MMT or whatever it is, and realize that they need more. It's actually because the top powers have got a lot of sovereignty in money, the others don't. The system is hierarchical. Right, and those who enter at the bottom are subordinated to the whole, and therefore the question of democracy poses itself very, very differently if you're in Kazakhstan, or if you are in Tanzania, or if you are in Paraguay, than if you are in Britain. It's dramatically different to what one central bank can do and what another can do. That's one point. The second point about the reforming the American system, which is obviously, how to put this? Ramshackle would be would be a polite word, right? They've made it up as they went along. And changing it is enormously difficult. But I'll tell you one point which also directly connects to Stefan's book. If you want to change the monetary dimension, you've got to start with credit, not with money. And that Marx's distinction is very important here. Marx had the monetary theory of credit, unlike the theories that inform much of what Stephen has done, which are basically credit theories of money. If you want to change the monetary dimension, you start with credit. In other words, you stop free capital flows. If you don't put controls on capital flows, forget about monetary change. It's impossible. You've got to start with that. That's what made Bretton Woods what it was. It wasn't the connection between the dollar and gold. It was actually controls over credit domestically and internationally. If that is not reversed, you can forget all discussion about monetary reform globally. It's impossible, just quite simply impossible. So that, I would very much like to read what Stefan thinks on that and his take on that. I mean, I know it will take him a lot of work, but he seems to have a lot of appetite for it. So more power to his elbow, and let's see what he comes up with.
Okay, I think that unfortunately we already ran over time, so we will have to be coming to a close. We will be pestering all the discussants and Stefan for the written version of the comments for the symposium of the European Open. We would like to move quickly, so as we say in Spanish, the deadline is yesterday. It's not actually that, but almost. And I think it will be, as I was saying, coming in this format that is going to be a standard in the journal. I think we have a very wide-ranging discussion. We obviously, and I think this is exactly the point, not to master a monolithic consensus, but different views were exposed. I think it was a great chance for the European Law Open to have all of you. And we wish that you stay on also with the journal. There will be at the end of July, which I know is a difficult time for obvious reasons, another webinar on the 7th member state, on the recent book on Algeria, with which we are having some problems finding also voices from Algeria itself in terms of the language and this kind of stuff. But we want to have these kind of discussions. And there will be also, but this coming next year because this is when it's coming published, another webinar. There will be others in the meantime, but there will be one that I think it relates strongly to what we are discussing with the forthcoming book of Charles Meyer, the doyen of European history, who is coming close to law in many ways, and is expanding on the Leviathan 2.0 book that he was writing some 7-8 years ago. I don't remember. I'm having problem in terms of orienting myself in time recently. Okay, so I don't speak more. I just thank you again, all of you, Stefan and all the discussants, for a very rich discussion. And I wish you a very nice morning, afternoon for those of you who are on the other side of the pond, and a very nice evening for those of you who are here. And please be benign with our pestering, because pestering we will be doing to you to get and extract the papers like a dentist out of your word processors. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the great engagement.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.